Welcome to WBC Faster Together, the LinkedIn Live series of Women Business Collaborative. I'm Gwen Young, Chief Executive Officer of WBC. And today, during this holiday season, we are joined by Paul Costello, the former Assistant Press Secretary to First Lady Rosalynn Carter, Deborah Taylor Tate, the former Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission and Director Emerita of the Tennessee Supreme Court, and our moderator, AC champion, author, and executive coach, and dear friend, Linda Peakshack. WBC is an unprecedented alliance of over 80 women business organizations and hundreds of business leaders building a movement to achieve equal position, pay, and power for all women in business. Through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability, we are mobilizing thousands to create momentum and accelerate the pace of change. We live our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and members of our leadership, our staff, our board of directors, and our champions include more than 34% people of color. And every one of our 9 action initiatives has DEI goals for 2025 and 2030. Please check the chat where you can see our 9 action initiatives through which we aim to accelerate change, and join our movement at wbcollaborative.org. Each week in this series, we offer different ways to advocate change and accelerate impact by presenting data, research, and best practices, by lifting up the power of women's voices for change, and by showcasing the importance of cross-generational collaboration, the allyship of men in the movement, and talking about the trailblazer women and men who are really leading for building advancement for equity throughout communities. And with that, Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. I'm honored to talk today with 2 longtime friends about their remembrances of 2 trailblazers and icons we lost in the last few weeks. First Lady Rosalynn Carter and the first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. Paul Costello was Rosalynn Carter's assistant press secretary in the White House and my colleague in the press office there, and has gone on to a stellar career leading public affairs offices in government, business, and education. And former FCC Commissioner Debi Taylor Tate, most recently the administrator of the courts in Tennessee, was known as the Children's Commissioner while she was at the FCC for her work internationally on the impact of media on children. They are here with me to reflect on what we learned from and what we owe to these 2 trailblazers and exemplary public servants. So, Paul, let's start with you. What surprised you about the coverage of First Lady Rosalynn Carter's death and memorial?
Well, what surprised me is the press got it right. And for years, the press has gotten it wrong about Rosalynn. And, I was surprised. I was actually quite shocked that they really understood the fundamental and historic role she played as First Lady, and that she led the way for women like Hillary Clinton and Mrs. Obama and other women who were trailblazers in their own way. One of the things that I continued to think about was Betty Ford met with Mrs. Carter prior to moving into the White House during the transition period. And Mrs. Ford said to Rosalynn about policy issues, do what you want to do, because no matter what you do, you'll be criticized. And I think Rosalynn really took that to heart, and it became sort of armor for her. Like the first trip that she took abroad was to South America, and to talk about the administration, Jimmy Carter's policy on human rights. And she didn't meet with first ladies, she met with the presidents of these nations. And they were shocked. They were shocked that the wife of the president of the United States was going to travel, meet them, and wanted to meet with them and talk about substantive issues. And that really set the ground for Rosalynn's path in the White House that continued. I think that she basically said she was fearless in many respects. And I think she basically said, I have this enormous spotlight, and I can shine it on whatever I choose. And she did. And I think that she was a historic figure, and I was really pleased the press finally got it. I went back and I read some pieces. Let me just add one thing. I read some pieces from the period, and I read a Washington Post piece that was written by a style section journalist, and it was written in the 70s, and it gave me PTSD to read it, actually, because it was so mean spirited and so shockingly so. And so, and I think the press corps that covers you day to day doesn't really understand how you'll fit in with history, what you'll look like 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And I think that they finally really understood Rosalynn.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of those first and how you and she dealt with the criticism when she, for instance, was only the second First Lady to testify before Congress, and the first Lady to go to Congress and say there needs to be an office of the First Lady. And as we heard at her memorial service, argued and got with the president equal pay for her staff, which I'm sure you appreciated as well.
I did.
And yeah, and the first to address the World Health Organization. So can you talk about some of those first, the ones you were with her on, and how you dealt with that criticism from the press?
Well, it was really tough to deal with. I think that in retrospect, when I look at the press corps, the press, the women, and they were women who covered the First Lady, they were Northern feminists. And I think that they really didn't get this woman from the South. They really didn't get her. They saw her as derivative of her husband and not her own. And this was the age of Gloria Steinem and significant feminists from the North. And I think they were sort of like, I know that she supports the ERA, and she never called herself a feminist, but she lived the life of a woman who was a feminist. I remember one of the things that surprised us the most was she sat in on cabinet meetings, and she sat on the side in a chair on the side with staff. And when the press found out that she was sitting in cabinet meetings, it was like an explosion. It was so, why? What right does she have? And we were all perplexed about it. This was a woman who traveled thousands, tens of thousands of miles in the US and abroad, talking about the administration, its accomplishments, et cetera. And why wouldn't she sit in a cabinet meeting and learn and pull in that knowledge and listen to the debates? It shocked me. I remember arguing with women who were feminists, women who were reporters who were feminists. Well, why is she sitting in there? Why is she entitled? And it just perplexed me. I mean, it surprised me.
I can understand that. One last question for you before we go to Debi. What memories do you have that capture kind of the essence of her, and not only the essence of her, but also of her relationship with President Carter?
Well, I think the thing that was most moving to me was in 1979 when the refugees were left Cambodia because of the Pol Pot regime. And there were tens of thousands of refugees on the borders of Cambodia and Laos. And the president and Mrs. Carter decided that she should go and she should highlight what was happening, the desperation that the living conditions of tens of thousands of people on the border. And so we left. One night we flew into Thailand, we flew into Bangkok, we stayed overnight in Bangkok, got up early in the morning and took helicopters out of Bangkok to visit 3 camps, one on the Laotian border, one on the Cambodian border, and one inside of Bangkok. And Rosalynn was one of the camps that we visited, tens of thousands of people. And it was just shocking. I mean, it was something that I never saw before, and she never saw before, and just the mass of humanity, desperate. And we went into a camp, we went into a tent, which was the hospital tent, and Rosalynn was walking around, and she was, greeted by the doctors, physicians who were working in there. And she sat at one point and held an infant in her arms. And I remember thinking it was so Madonna-like, and I don't mean the pop singer Madonna, I mean the mother of Christ. And she was sitting there holding this infant. And it was one of the most powerful moments that I'd ever seen with her. We got up to leave. We left the tent. We continued walking back. Someone came up to her and told her that the baby had just died. The baby had just passed away. And she was bereft. We got on the choppers and Rosalynn was quietly sobbing. And she was determined when she came back to the United States that she was going to do something about it. She met with the UN chief and asked for the UN to put together a leader on this issue of relief. She went before Congress and she got the president to allocate millions of dollars in refugee relief. And I think it was the power of Rosalynn. She understood once again that she could put a spotlight on an issue. She held, innumerable meetings at the White House with corporations, with philanthropic people to raise money for this effort. And it was the power. It was the singular power of what a first lady can do and how a first lady can really change dire conditions.
And we've seen her and the president through the years. We've seen her caring. We've seen her in Africa holding babies and being with children there in their post-presidency. So this was something she continued to shine a light on. Let me go to Debi, and then at the end, we'll come back to Rosalynn's relationship with President Carter. Debi, you have a very personal story of being inspired by Justice O'Connor and what you learned from her and about choosing a mentor. Can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, Linda, thanks so much to you and WBC. I just think this is so important to hold up and celebrate these two trailblazers. So thank you. And it means so much to me, a little farm girl from Tennessee, to be able to come and talk about Sandra Day O'Connor. And in 1981, when she was appointed, I was a brand new lawyer. I had grown up in rural Tennessee. I only knew one lady lawyer my entire lifetime. And so I was constantly on the lookout for mentors to help me as I began my professional career. And so I just decided I'm just going to take Sandra Day O'Connor. She's very much like me. She referred to herself until the very end as a cowgirl. That's how she wanted to be remembered. But all along the way, she ran for public office. She was in every branch of government. People often forget she was the first female majority leader of the Senate in Arizona. She became a trial judge, then she was on the appellate court, and literally it was like a roadmap for what I wanted to do with my life. And I knew I wanted to be in public service. And so in all my speeches, I was already giving a lot of speeches to organizations and women's groups. And so one slide was about the importance, as you said, of a mentor. And I would always say mentors can be men, Paul. They don't just have to be women. And they can also be someone that you just emulate. Follow what their career is like, how they treat people, how they act, what they do. So indeed, what an honor it was to actually meet her several years later and be able to tell her that she had been my mentor for many years of my professional career and how much she had meant to me. And I'm sure in the back of her mind, knowing her a little bit better over the years, she was probably saying, "Oh, hogwash, how could I have been your mentor from afar?" But just the story of our first meeting is another lesson in life. So she was at a big national, actually international conference of the junior leagues, huge, 1,000 women were there, and she was receiving the most prestigious award given by this women's organization for her continued service after being at the United States Supreme Court. And many people know this, that she had been feeding the hungry, baking bread, going to homeless shelters, and she continued to do that and was determined to continue her volunteering after she got to the United States Supreme Court, even with that huge caseload that she had. And so it was just by being herself, it was the way she lived her life that was so very inspirational to me. Not just her opinions, not just that she was the first female on the court, although obviously that was so important for the United States and for our legal profession to be able to see that. But I loved over the years, every time that I saw her, being able to say, remember me, I'm your mentee from afar, even though I don't even think we knew those words back then.
That's right.
And
well, I love
Linda, I had a funny story that I also wanted to tell you about John, her husband. So everyone knows of their incredible love affair throughout their whole life, and how he left his huge job being a managing partner of a big law firm to come and support her as a Supreme Court justice. But at the same conference, he was invited to introduce her. And so he gets up there and he's lovingly looking down at her, and he's talking about her brilliant legal mind. And she was at the top of her class at Stanford, which, Paul, I know you're a professor there and you know how difficult that is. And that she was so stunningly beautiful that everyone turned every time she walked into the room, and he waxed on for about 5 minutes. She got up there and very pragmatically looked out at the audience and said, there were only 3 of us in all of the law school, so I didn't have much competition. So it was pretty funny, actually, that she was so self-deprecating and had so much humor and so much wit and charm. So again, it was both, her professional career, but also her personal integrity.
Yeah, that you really captured it. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that you received that same award years later. And we should acknowledge that. So what do you think, Debi, is her lasting legacy from her time on the high court? I know you have some ideas about how she could be a model for today.
Right. Well, I think there were both little things and huge things. And so I remember in one of the books, as soon as she got there, she started making these, what were tiny changes, but they became huge, significant changes. She asked that on the office suites, instead of it being Mr. Justice Powell, Mr. Justice whomever, that it would just be Justice, because she didn't want it to be Miss, Mrs., or Ms., And so just that tiny change. She did the same thing for filings that were filed by women attorneys, or how the justices actually recognized whoever the attorney was in a particular case, so that once again, the filings were signed by Ms., not a Miss or a Mrs. And she started a tradition that she wanted all the justices to eat together every week, lunch, one meal, so that they would know each other personally, not just professionally, not just when they saw each other on the bench. And so guess who would be in your office if you didn't show up for lunch one day? Sandra Day O'Connor would be. And like Paul was saying about Rosalynn, she used her platform every single time she had a chance. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer, she was very open about it. She talked about it. She lobbied for and was a huge advocate for all types of breast cancer issues. And then I know what you probably want me to talk about are some of the cases, and I'll just briefly mention those. But I know that probably the one at the forefront even today is Roe v. Wade. And it was probably shocking to President Reagan and a lot of the conservatives who had backed her appointment when she actually voted to uphold Roe v. Wade. It was very interesting. One of the other lessons that I learned from her that I tried to remember at the FCC was only make the decision that is in front of you today. And so it's very interesting. She was very involved in a lot of the affirmative action cases, but she voted on both sides of those because she would look at the particular issue that was in front of her on that day. She voted down a Mississippi law that only allowed women to go to nursing schools. You know, of course, she said men should be able to go to nursing schools. And so I think that you know, she also was such a centrist, and she was such a consensus builder, and she would go from office to office trying to almost trade so that she could get a vote, so that they could come to a consensus, you know, on a case, instead of, you know, throwing bombs, you know, or criticizing other stances on a particular case. So those are just some of the highlights that really have meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually called the O'Connor Court for a while,
Yes,
right?
yes,
She was
it
the swing vote.
absolutely was. And, you
Yeah.
know, one commentator said she actually saved us from the extremists. Boy, could we use some of that now.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I want to jump to my final question for both of you. And that is, what did you learn from these women that you have carried on into your stellar careers? Is there a quote or a piece of advice or a lesson that you learned, lesson or lessons that you learned? And Paul, I'll start with you and ask you to answer that question, but also to spend a minute on the relationship between President Carter and First Lady Rosalynn Carter.
Well, you know, people I think realize, especially now that they've seen the president and the president coming to Mrs. Carter's memorial service and the condition that he's in, which is quite incapacitated. And I think that people really understood and understand the breadth and depth of their love and the breadth and depth of their commitment to each other. And, you know, that was clear to those of us who worked in the White House, as you know, Linda. We saw that all the time. I remember one time it was during the 80 campaign. And as you remember, the 80 campaign was quite tough. We were running against Ronald Reagan. Ted Kennedy had done an insurgent campaign during the primaries against the president. And we were on probably a 5-state trip, and we were ready to leave, I think, St. Louis, and Rosalynn was told that the president was calling her. She went in on a secure phone. She talked to the president. Came out, we took off. We were about at 35,000 feet, and Rosalynn said, I talked to Jimmy and I told him, it's really tough out here. You know, I'm getting a lot of negative feedback. It's really, really hard. It's a very tough environment, Jimmy. And she probably gave him some political advice because she was much more political than the president. The president always said, I don't want to do the political decision. I want to do the decision that I believe is best for the country. Whereas Rosalynn would have said, okay, I understand that, but let's do more political decisions because we want a second term. And so we took off and we're sitting there, and I think we were eating, because I almost choked on my steak, I think it was at that point. And she said, I talked to Jimmy, and I told him it's really tough out here. It's really rough. And he said, Rosalynn, I don't want to hear about it. And she said, well, Jimmy Carter, you can go to hell. And I hung up on him. And it was like, you saw the reality of the inferno of a campaign, the stress that one goes through. You know, it just told me the dynamics of this couple, that she always was forthright with him. She always brought back, as we travel the country, she always brought back, she was his eyes and ears, as Eleanor Roosevelt said she was for FDR. And Rosalynn was very much that. And she brought back the reality of what it looked like in America. And we were in Mondale, Rosalynn and Fritz Mondale were really the only people out there campaigning as the chief spokespeople for the campaign during the 80 campaign, because the president had said he was not going to leave the White House until the hostages were released. And we were probably out 6 days a week campaigning across the country. And she was forthright in everything she told the president. And I think that was the nature of the relationship that never changed.
That's great. That's great. Is there one piece of advice that she gave you that or a lesson you learned from her that you've carried forward as you have risen to the heights of the public affairs world?
I think commitment. That the Carters have they left the White House with their tails between their legs because we had lost the Senate. The whole change in Washington occurred at the end of the Carter presidency. And the Carters were going back to Plains, Georgia, basically broke. And they had to start a new life again. And they decided they weren't going to go out and do speeches for 50,000, 70,000, whatever the going price was. And they formulated the Carter Center. And as we know now, the Carter Center has been one of the most successful institutions in the United States and around the globe, that they have fundamentally changed health issues around the globe and mostly in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think the life commitment to being good, responsible people and also making change. And that was something that was always stood out for me, that Rosalynn and the president's commitment to making change and doing things that would alter situations.
I think that's right. And what, I think we both took away is this idea that you base your communication in truth, which is always something that for those of us in public affairs and communication, at least I carried through in my career. Debi, let's close out with the lessons, the advice that you took away from watching and getting to know Sandra Day O'Connor.
So all kinds of things, like she always made sure that half of her law clerks were women. She had walking meetings. So like her, I would go walk the Jefferson Memorial, see the cherry blossoms with my staff. She said, don't ever let criticism of your wardrobe bother you. Learn to find a consensus. And I guess what I really think is, after looking at so many of the tributes and news stories, I think about the thousands and thousands of women who have been influenced. And even young girls in grammar school said that she influenced them to go to law school. And so it's, if a cowgirl could do it, then you can do it too. And so she inspired me every juncture, every opportunity, every challenge. Even when you feel like you might not be up to it, say yes. And then I'll just say that I wanted to read this. It's very quick. She longed, because I think it's such a great way to remind us about her. She longed for the ranch where she grew up. She imagined the big western sky and remembered the hard-earned truths of it, where the unforgiving vastness of the high desert she had learned to be at once selfless and self-reliant.
Deb, you mentioned cowgirl, and as soon as you mentioned that, I thought of Rosalynn, First Lady from Plains.
Yes,
Plains, Georgia.
Exactly.
A rural part, 2 hours plus from Atlanta. Who ever knew that these women would reach the pinnacle of life in many respects, of leadership, in the ability to really change dynamics?
And Paul, what a fresh air, both from the South and from the Southwest, right? In DC.
Right.
And misunderstood in DC for a part of their time there, right? We could keep going on much longer, but I'm supposed to end this at 12:30, and that's what we're going to do. So any last comments before we close out this really fabulous conversation that I thank you for? Paul, any last comments?
I think that the commitment to change, the commitment to doing good things, commitment to that no matter how we spend our lives, in the careers that we do, always keep a focus on the things the tangible things we can do to make this world a better place. And the Carters are an exemplar of that.
Great. Debi, one last
You know,
thought?
We really didn't get to, well, Paul referenced global, but I think a lot of people don't realize that even in her retirement, Justice O'Connor stayed so involved and engaged, and international work, especially with aspiring women judges and leaders in developing nations, became a passion for her, along with her iCivics and trying to bring civics back to young people.
Thank you both so much for helping us close out this in such a good way and for a wonderful conversation. Thanks to the people who joined us today. You can share this with other people at the same LinkedIn Live link. And we hope that you will join us next week when Gwen will have another guest on WBC Faster Together. Please go to wbcollaborative.org to learn more about